CSIS. I'm Dr. Mark Moyer, the head of the project on military and diplomatic history here. We just relocated. Some of you probably at our earlier events, we used to be right at DuPont Circle, but with the reshuffling of think tanks that happens after elections, we looked for a new home, and we're very privileged to find this place, which, as you can see, has great facilities, great scholars. We are going to continue doing some events off-site with government audiences, but now that we got this great space, we are planning to do a lot here, and you can check us out online, where we have a schedule. We've got another event tomorrow with a grad student, Tommy Jameson of Harvard, who won our first annual graduate student prize. So we like to try to promote junior scholars as well as more senior and distinguished scholars like our speaker today. And a lot of why our center was created was because military and diplomatic history have been under siege both in the academic world and the policy world. We think history should play a bigger role in public policy and historically informed people. And we like to think that history doesn't give you a pat answer in most cases, but the understanding of history gives you familiarization and context that you're not going to find in other places. And there's actually quite a few distinguished historians who have been talking about this and writing about this. A couple near here, Frank Gavin, Hal Brands, Neil Ferguson, Victor Davis Hanson, Graham Allison. We also have Mike Green here at CSIS. But we also, our speaker today, Jeremi Suri, is also among those who has written effectively. And I want to also highlight, in addition to the book today, this was a recent volume that he co-edited with Hal Brands, The Power of the Past, History and Statecraft, which is a great example of how to use history to understand current policy issues. Jeremi actually was one of the first speakers we had last year. He's also the first one we've had this year. We wanted to make sure we started by making a good impression, and he did a great job last time, and I'm sure he's going to do a great job for us today. He also happens to have a book on a subject that might have some contemporary interest, the presidency. He'll be talking about this. There's also copies out there if you haven't picked one up already. I'll give you a brief introduction of Jeremi. He's the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership and Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a professor in the Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and serves as the academic director for the Executive Master in Public Leadership program. He teaches courses on strategy and decision-making, leadership, globalization, international relations, and modern history. And he is the author and editor of 9 books, this being his most recent. In fact, it just came out yesterday was the publication date, so literally hot off the presses. You should also mention, I get a lot of questions about where should people be studying military and diplomatic history today, and I think in the past you might have said Harvard or Yale might be the places you want to go, but times have really changed, and UT has really become, I think, the best place to go. So for those who are thinking about graduate school, think about it. He's also already got a very extensive network, and I've already met a couple of your grad students here today, so it's great to see that you are building the next generation, so to speak. So we are going to listen to Jeremi, and then I'll ask him a few questions, and then we will open it up to the audience. So, Jeremi.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for that kind introduction.
Sure.
Well, good afternoon. I'm really grateful for coming here, and I'm grateful that I've been able to speak for Mark's program 2 years in a row. I think what's most needed in our society today is the rigorous use of research to address policy problems. We have no shortage of problems in the world, but we have far too few efforts, especially in the area of foreign policy, where history is so important, where we're actually using research to address our problems, not beginning with ideological prepositions first. And I think Mark is a model of what I call good empirical research, and that's why I'm always glad to come and speak for Mark. And I'm delighted to talk about my new book here. Let me say a little bit about why I wrote this book, and that'll also bring me to the argument of the book and what I hope the book's contribution is. I started writing this book, as those of you who know me know, a long time before Donald Trump was a presidential candidate. The book is not about Donald Trump. My wife is convinced subconsciously it was because I grew up in New York City watching Donald Trump. So perhaps he was there in some recess, some nightmarish recess of my mind. But I began the book 4.5 years ago when I finished my nation-building book, when I came to realize, having done that project, how poor a lot of the policy scholarship and historical scholarship in particular on the presidency is. That's not to say there aren't a lot of good books about presidents, but the good books about presidents tend to be about the presidents as individuals and about their administrations in a curiously ahistorical way. You see, we tend to study a particular individual, and the way we study them, we actually give them more power than they in fact had, more efficacy. We tell the story around them. What we do not have very much of, especially in the world of policy scholarship, is scholarship on the presidency as an office, and how the office has evolved, and how the office affects policymaking, and how the policymaking has affected those who are in the office. So the way to think about this book is, although it is built around the drivers of the car, it is more about the machinery of the car of the presidency than it is about the individuals in it. The individuals stand in to help us understand that. And why do I think this is important? I think it's crucially important because I think one of the most important insights a historian has is that the office itself has evolved significantly over time, and the evolution of the office is not just about the people in it. More often than not, the office has made the president as much as the president has made the office. It's not a one-way street. There's, of course, a negotiation in both directions, but the office is crucially significant. And that point of departure is actually the point of departure for my argument. Because what I observed, and what I think the research shows pretty clearly, is that as Arthur Schlesinger argued 40 years ago, the power of the presidency has continuously increased as the power of the United States has increased. Maybe that's changing now, but over the last 200 years, we can argue the presidency has become a more and more powerful office. I'll say more about that. But since at least the mid-20th century, the increase in power has not increased the efficacy of the office, particularly in foreign policy. And so the question is, why? Why is it that for 150 years, the increase in power in the office actually produces a more powerful United States, a more effective United States, not always a good United States, but a more effective United States? And why is it that post-45, particularly since post-1960s, presidents find themselves able to do more, but more and more frustrated in the limits of their power? The Vietnam moment that Mark has written about better than anyone else is one of these examples, but certainly not the most. Every president since Kennedy, if they lived to tell the story, has lived to say, I didn't realize how constrained I'd be when I was in that office. So how do we understand this? What has actually happened? And my argument is, and I'm going to narrate this a bit for you, my argument in the book, The Story I Tell, is a story of the growth of power to serve national purposes, but then the power itself becoming more of a driver than the actual actors themselves in office, which is to say that the scale and scope of the presidency comes to actually undermine it as such. The concept I like to use is one of gigantism, and something Americans are often not comfortable talking about. But at some level, getting so big, getting so large, actually undermines what you're able to do. And I think this is the historical moment the United States has been in for quite some time. We have so much wealth, so much capability, but it in fact debilitates us. Why does it debilitate us? It debilitates us because it creates an endless stream of responsibilities and obligations. It creates endless pressures and expectations far beyond the reality of what one can do. So another way of thinking of this story is it's a history of the growth of power in the United States to serve purposes, but then that power becoming so great that it undermines the actual exercise and achievement of the purposes for which the United States has sought to use its power. And if this is true, and obviously I think it is, this has major implications, not just for the way we think about Donald Trump, but for the way we think about the office. And to preview my conclusion, I just want to preview this now, I'll say more about it in a couple of minutes, it also means that the solution is not just to have a better president. One of the takeaways from my book is that we are spending too much time talking about the individuals, not enough time talking about the structure of power in the United States. It doesn't mean the individuals don't matter, but it means that the problem is the problem of the presidency as well as those in it. And so even the perfect president, whoever that would be, will not solve this problem. I would say the same thing, by the way, about the Pentagon and about many other institutions. Okay, so let me tell this story, and I want to begin at the beginning with the origins of the presidency. And origin stories are very important for policymakers because they tell us why things exist the way they do, where they come from. And the origins of the presidency are actually one of the most interesting parts of the early formation of American society because the founders did not agree on what the office should entail. So anyone who tells you that they are acting under the original intent of the founders is by definition wrong, because there is no original intent of the founders with the office. In fact, the founders expected, insofar as they agreed on anything, they very clearly expected that the president would be chosen by the House of Representatives. The presumption was that large states would nominate favorite sons, no one would get a majority of the electoral vote, and as happened in 1824, the House of Representatives would choose among the top 4 electoral vote getters, basically the favorite sons of New York, Ohio, Virginia, and Massachusetts. And in fact, the first sets of presidents are from Massachusetts and Virginia as such. That was the presumption. That's what they assumed would happen. They couldn't agree on what the office should do and what the scope of the office should be. So in fact, Article 2 of the Constitution, which lays out presidential powers, is actually one of the vaguest parts of the Constitution as such. As Clinton Rossiter argued a decade, or actually a generation ago, what they did is they created an office that mixed many, many different things, many, many different inclinations as a compromise, as what they hope would be an office in formation to create a new model of leadership. And it turned out to be the most creative, but also the most problematic part of the constitutional structure. James Madison at one point said that the president was to be a democratic patriot king. And of course, that's a contradiction, right? That's part of the point. The president was to represent the people, embody the people as a monarch would, to embody the deeper urges of the society, to be above party, to be above party. They were clear on that. But the president was also to be someone connected to the people. The president was to be accountable to the people. The president was to be someone who was not ruling by divine authority, but by meritocracy instead. And the president was to be a warrior, an intellectual, a manager, so many things at one time. They threw all of these things in. Rossiter counted 25 different job descriptions for the president within the limited language of the founders themselves. That early on, ladies and gentlemen, was actually one of the great strengths of the office, because the president was able to do so many different things, but not do any of them completely on his own. The president became a figure who was able to flexibly adjust to different needs, and most significantly, to do the things necessary to unify the country at particular moments. So George Washington, who really creates the presidency in the mold of his activities, and I spend a whole chapter talking about Washington, I encourage everyone to go online and read his diary. This is why the internet is good, despite all the other problems we see, is we have access to this kind of material. Washington spent most of his presidency not mediating between Jefferson and Hamilton, as the play Hamilton would have you believe. He spent most of his presidency going around the country, meeting with people, and trying to instill a sense of Americanness in them. That's what the job of the president was in his eye, to build a common Americanness, to do things that would knit this country together. As Washington well recognized, Virginians and people who live in Massachusetts, I don't know what they're called, Massachusettsans, they didn't think of themselves as Americans. And Washington's role was to use the president as a unifier for the nation. And his farewell address, of course, is all about that. In fact, he calls the Union sacred. It's a sacred bond that we must build among ourselves. Andrew Jackson, who I think is the next stage in the presidency, takes this office of unification and actually brings it to the people. He's the first frontier president. Jackson's goal is to use the presidency to empower those who have not been within the elite mainstream of American society, particularly white settlers, and to disempower those who he sees as impediments to them. That would be Indians in particular. So he is taking the presidency, moving it from this unifying office, and actually making it more of a militarized office to bring citizens together on the frontier. And that, ladies and gentlemen, sets the stage for Lincoln, which I think is really the second stage in the presidency. You can see Washington and Jackson as a first stage in the presidency. Lincoln, I spend a lot of time on Lincoln in the book. Anyone who spends time reading Lincoln is drawn into Lincoln, I just have to say. Not only is Lincoln the person who ends up obviously being the military leader of the Union forces during the Civil War, but also the individual having to command his generals who has to redefine what American society is. And Lincoln turns the presidency, and you see this every day when you go to the Lincoln Memorial, he turns the presidency into an office that redesigns and rebuilds the nation. He's the first real nation-building president. During the Civil War, Lincoln undertakes three major transformations in American society that he is able to do because of the vagueness of the office, none of which are mentioned in the Constitution, all of which change forever the way the president operates. He makes the president, for the first time, the industrial manager of the economy, investing in land and economic development across the country. That's what the Homestead Act is of 1862, providing land. This is an important point to make. Land to citizens who will work the land even if they are not citizens as such, which is to say you did not have to be actually a full citizen at the time. So even immigrants who come into the United States are given access to land to be part of a capitalist economy. Lincoln's vision was a society of free labor, free soil, free men. I'm often asked, why was Lincoln opposed to slavery? He had his moral objections to it, but he saw slavery as an impediment to opportunity for poor white men whose wages would be brought down by slavery. So the goal of the Republican Party, the role of Lincoln as president, is to actually remove the cancerous impediments to capitalist development and provide the lineages, the infrastructure. It's under Lincoln that the Transcontinental Railroad is built and completed soon after his presidency, and it is Lincoln who actually creates what becomes one of the defining elements of modern America, our university system. The public land grant system is created under the Morrill Act of 1862, passed by Lincoln, funded by Lincoln. Every state in the Union is given land that it will sell to found the creation of major research universities. The legislation of the Morrill Act, it's really interesting, is about training farmers to be more effective producers and to train them also in the highest liberal arts. Lincoln's vision was that every farmer would know science and become a scientific farmer and a reader of Shakespeare. He is taking the president from unifier of Washington and Jackson and making the president nation builder. And it's interesting because both Bismarck and Tolstoy, two people you often don't talk about together, both view Lincoln as the great modern American for that reason. It's a totally different presidency. His presidency sets the stage for Theodore Roosevelt, who will now take this more capitalist, industrial-driven office and now actually make the president a reformer, a regulator as such. Theodore Roosevelt is a great progressive president of the early 20th century. He's responsible for antitrust legislation. He's responsible for civil service reform. He's responsible for putting helmets on football players so their heads don't get cracked open, right? He's responsible for using the presidency to initiate, to push for reform on a scale that was not possible before. He sees himself as the national reformer. And that sets the stage really for the third part of the rise of the presidency, as I describe it, which is what brings us to the hero, but also in some ways the tragic figure of my book, Franklin Roosevelt. Because Franklin Roosevelt, well aware of this history, I think he in fact thought of it exactly this way. Roosevelt, coming to the presidency during the Depression, recognizes that the office also needs to play a healing role. If it's played a unifying role, an industrializing and nation-building role, it now needs to play a healing role for the rough edges of a capitalist economy, for the rough edges of a frontier society, for the rough edges of a society of inequality, for the rough edges of a society that's incredibly violent, in fact. And Roosevelt makes himself, Franklin does, into the great national healer, the model of the presidency that we still find most recognizable today. It's really important, by the way, that Roosevelt, and I show this in the book, is the most cited president by all the next presidents. Ronald Reagan himself the one who you might think least likely to cite Roosevelt because of his opposition to so many of what were seen as Rooseveltian social welfare policies, gives his second-to-last speech before his official farewell address at the Roosevelt Library and says, and I quote the whole speech in the book, says that not only was Franklin Roosevelt his model as a communicator on the radio, Franklin Roosevelt was his model as a leader, a person who touched the better parts of citizens and brought them hope. We have tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of oral histories from Roosevelt's presidency at the Library of Congress and elsewhere, and there's a recurring strain in them, which is that Roosevelt brought the president to me. If Washington used the president to bring us together, Lincoln used the president to advance an industrial nation, Roosevelt brought it home to me. My favorite story that I tell in the book, it's one of so many, but it's my favorite, is the story of Saul Bellow, the great novelist. Many of you have heard of Saul Bellow, I presume. So Saul Bellow was the child of he himself was a Russian Jewish immigrant in Chicago. And he describes how growing up in Chicago in the 20s, he was convinced that all politicians were crooks. As of course, it's still true in Chicago, right? They're all crooks. And he never listened to them. And he said, all I did on election day was figure out who I was supposed to vote for and vote for them. That's how you got a job, voting for the right people. He describes how, after leaving the University of Wisconsin because he couldn't afford to pay his tuition during the Depression, walking through the streets of Chicago one night, he saw all the cars go off the road, people roll down their windows and turn on the radio. And he said there was this man with this funny accent on the radio. I couldn't always understand what he said. But when I did understand him, he spoke to me. He says Roosevelt was the first politician who ever spoke to him. And it's ironic because Roosevelt's background could not have been more different. The child of elites, a Yankee through and through, and here this Russian Jewish immigrant kid who's so skeptical. And if you know Saul Bellow's novels, they're filled with cynicism. Sees in Roosevelt something. What was it he saw in Roosevelt? I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out. It's the same thing my students see in Roosevelt today, or hear in him when I play his fireside chats for them. Roosevelt did not, as president, set himself out as the great policy leader. He set himself out as someone who could empathize, understand people's problems. And he teaches us as foreign policy scholars how important that is for managing foreign policy. He had a thoroughly isolationist country that he was determined to bring to war by 1939, and the only way he was able to do it was not by telling people they were stupid and should listen to him, but by expressing empathy for their plight, but also the plight of people overseas. And if you read his speeches and listen to his addresses from 39 to 41, he goes through the problems of other societies, what fascism means, expressing empathy for victims elsewhere, and saying, if we have empathy for them, we must also do this for our security. As he said, as a fire spreads, one must help one's neighbor. This becomes the basis for Lend-Lease. This becomes the basis for the Destroyer for Bases deal. It becomes the basis for American entry into the war. By the time of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Roosevelt has, I think, created in the American public a different consciousness of the rest of the world. What I'm saying here is that what made him distinctive as president and what changed the presidency was the emotional role the president started to play in people's ordinary lives and the ways in which emotion became part of policy making as such. Roosevelt, throughout his presidency, would do this. I show in the book Roosevelt's calendar for the day after Pearl Harbor. And it's interesting, he spends far more time not figuring out how to spin, but figuring out how to talk to the American people and explain to them why this is important, which is different from trying to persuade people of a position you've already taken. It's about building a connection and a consensus for policy. He's the last president to do that. He is the last great president, I argue, because he takes this office that had done so many things and expands it out. By the end of his presidency, he's overseeing directly the atomic project. He will take responsibility for the reconstruction of parts of Europe and Asia that will be followed through, of course, by Harry Truman. He's managing a war on 4 continents, and he's also managing the American economy on a scale no president has before. Quite literally, in 1945, almost all Americans worked for Franklin Roosevelt, the war industries of one kind or another, and he has, in fact, integrated the war industries before the rest of society has been integrated as such. Roosevelt greatly expands the office, but he is still able to do all the things required. The presidents who come after Roosevelt will not be able to do that. They will struggle in a way he did not struggle, and part of the struggle will not be because they are less talented, but because the scale has now become undoable for them. And I try to show this in particular by comparing Roosevelt and Kennedy in the book, and by actually looking at their calendars. One of the great things about being a historian is we work with the original material, and so you can try to recreate people's lives. It is not good policy analysis to do policy from 30,000 feet. Right? We have to look at how the policymakers themselves experience it. Roosevelt has, as difficult as his leadership is during World War II, and as difficult as Lincoln's is during the Civil War, these men are able to focus on a few issues, and they're able to take a lot of time hearing different viewpoints, thinking through issues, and they're able to try a lot of different things out. Roosevelt himself put it this way. He said, "My approach to policy making, including strategy, is one word: experimentation." And then he said in another conversation, famously, that his method was juggling. I try one thing with one hand, one thing with the other. And if something's working, I do more of it. If something's not working, I do less of it. That is exactly how he conducted military strategy. Roosevelt made more mistakes, perhaps, than other presidents in war, but he also made a lot of good choices, too. And he only made the good choices because he had also made the bad choices and studied the failure as well as the success. This is a side point, but a point that I think is really important. We valorize the idea that you have to fail to succeed, but then we tell people they can't fail. So what happens post-Roosevelt, for the most part, especially the last 30 or 40 years, lots of things fail, but we just call them success. So some of you might have seen I wrote a piece in the Washington Post on Monday, and one of the points I made in the piece was that it's been a long time since the United States won a war. I think that's a fact. And I got a lot of flack from certain people saying, well, no, we won wars. Like, we won in Iraq. I mean, if that's victory, I don't know. I don't know what victory is. It seems to me like it's giving an A for a C paper. Right? The point here is, it's a serious point, right? That if you're going to learn from failure, you have to recognize a failure as a failure. Roosevelt had the self-confidence to do that. I think we've lost that as such. The presidency after Roosevelt is fundamentally different. If you look in the book, I've reproduced these calendars to manifest my point. Roosevelt's presidency is doing more on scales exponentially greater than Washington's, but it is still a manageable individual job. Roosevelt has small meetings per day. He has lots of time to think. He has a lot of spontaneity in his day. His calendar is made around the mission, around his priorities. Post-Roosevelt, particularly by Kennedy's time, certainly by the early 1960s, the world looks very different. President Kennedy's calendar is typed up. It's to the 15-minute interval, and it is filled days in advance, not by him, but by his staff. And so, as I show in the book, on the day when Kennedy is briefed very quickly about the missiles found in Cuba, he spends most of the day on other things and struggles to barely get into the discussions. And he will spend the next week, while it is still secret, having to do all sorts of other things he doesn't want to do, and not being in the meetings he needs to be in, or not getting into them until he's late and ill-informed. And he himself will later say this. He will say, after the crisis, we cannot afford another crisis like this. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. This is a problem with the way we study crises as scholars. We study the crisis as if that's the priority of the actor, when it's not. Roosevelt, like Lincoln, was able to shift and serve mission priorities. Kennedy was not. The day Kennedy is briefed, by the way, on the missiles in Cuba, he's entertaining the King of Libya. Roosevelt never entertained the King of Libya. He's dealing with campaign contributions. That was never an issue on the same scale for Roosevelt. And most significant of all, he has 3 different interactions with press groups. Roosevelt didn't do anything on that scale. The day is divided and fragmented, and the president has trouble focusing on priorities. Lyndon Johnson's the next president I talk about, and you can see where this is going. No president worked harder than Lyndon Johnson. He worked, I think, 20 hours a day, every day he was president. His nighttime reading is longer than the reading that most of my graduate students do in one night. That was his nighttime reading, not what he was doing during the day. But yet, Lyndon Johnson found himself going issue to issue, and in the end, being much more tactical than strategic. I put in the book the calendar for March 8th, 1965. That's the day American Marines are sent to Da Nang, the first combat deployment of American Marines. On that same day, Lyndon Johnson is dealing with George Wallace and the March in Selma. On that same day, he's dealing with campaign contribution issues. Yet again, they come up all the time in the calendars. He's dealing with a problem within Democratic Party leadership in Congress, and he is also dealing with a natural disaster in the West, all on the same day. And we segment those issues in the way we study them. He's flipping from one to the other. His calendar is 8 pages just for the morning, What you find, what you see, is that presidents are not working on what they want to work on, and they are in continual reactive mode. That it reaches the point where the responsibility of the United States and the hubris and expectation of the president is so great that he is doing a little bit of everything and nothing very well, never having the time to really devote. My chapter on Reagan makes that same point, and that to me was one of the more interesting chapters to write because Reagan recognized this point. Reagan's whole point of departure was to say, I'm not going to be a micromanager. I can't do everything. I'm going to turn things over to others. And I think, and I'm not the only one to argue this, one of the great accomplishments of Ronald Reagan is in rethinking the relationship with the Soviet Union, despite what his advisors, including Robert Gates, tell him. They tell him that the Soviet Union has not changed. Reagan says, no, I want to hear and see other things. He devotes the time to think the issue through, and he does better than most of his predecessors. But he finds himself getting pulled into issues he does not want to be pulled into and making bad, reactive decisions because he doesn't have time. The most famous one, the most infamous one is Iran-Contra. What really happens with Iran-Contra? The crisis is that Americans are being held hostage. And Reagan feels political pressure and probably personal guilt and wants to get them released. So instead of following his own strategic policy of not negotiating with terrorists, he tells his staff, while that's our policy, I want you to get these hostages freed for me. Get this solved. It's a tactical, not a strategic answer. It's a tactical one. And then he's also telling his staff, the same staff, Oliver North and others, the Contras really need us. And Congress is putting up all kinds of problems for me. Find some way to do this. He's making snap, tactical reactions to deep problems. His staff then goes and follows his lead. And he finds himself in a place he never expected to be in, where very quickly we are paying the terrorists, right? Sending them weapons, and then giving money to the Contras in the South, in Nicaragua, doing all that at the same time. This reflects, even for someone who saw himself as a strategist, as a CEO, exactly the same problems of a Lyndon Johnson and a John F. Kennedy. And there is no equivalent before World War II. The United States wasn't involved in as many places. Presidents didn't seek to do that. The office was far more limited in the range of what it did. It did not get itself into those troubles. I believe that this fragmentation, this overstretch, this loss of mission, this mission creep in the presidency and in American foreign policy is what has contributed in the last 4 presidential elections to what seems to be an American search to put people in office who know nothing about foreign policy. If you go Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, it's extraordinary how little foreign policy knowledge you have there, how little they even claimed to have it. And it seems as if the American public has come to the conclusion that, in fact, an outsider needs to be the one doing this because the people on the inside are too caught up in playing the same game. And we need someone from the outside. And it's an interesting test for historians because each of those 4, we don't know about Trump yet, ends up falling into doing exactly the same thing. Ends up falling into doing. Clinton says we're going to enter a world of engagement and enlargement of democracy with no more interventions like before, and finds himself bombing Belgrade. Right? George W. Bush, in the one debate before the election on foreign policy with Al Gore, says this nation should not do we should not do nation building. And Condi Rice writes a piece in Foreign Affairs before the election saying the Army does not do windows. The Army just fights and wins wars. And we all know what happens in Afghanistan and Iraq. And President Obama comes into office and says the United States must move out of a war setting. Must move out of a war setting. We are not fighting a war on terror anymore, but finds much of his presidential foreign policy defined, one way or another, by the use of drones in the Middle East and by a further engagement with conflict in Libya and Syria, as well as in Iraq and Afghanistan. None of them escape this. All of their foreign policies are more tactical and strategic. In fact, it's very hard to find strategic unity in any of their foreign policies. And I think the American public's desire for an outsider to blow up the system is a reaction to that. But it's a misunderstanding. It's not that those men were not well suited to make policy, not that they didn't try to do different, but it is that the office and the pressures of the office pulled them into what were reactive, tactical, non-strategic decisions that in the long run undermine the purposes of American power. If I'm correct with this, I think there are a number of implications for policy today. And I want to just spend a little time on that, and some of these are in the book, but not all of them are. I've been thinking about this as we go. I think I hinted all of these, but I want to spend a little time before I stop talking, because one of the things I want to talk about is how history matters for current policy. And I really don't think, I want everyone to read this book, but I don't think you read this book and it tells you what to do. This book does not have a solution to our problems today. I'm much better on the problems than the solutions. But I want to show how I think it offers us some ways to think about how we go forward. So a few things here. One, if I'm correct about the complexity and the fragmentation of power and the way in which the growth of power actually makes power more difficult to use, the way in which the car engine has become much harder to drive, it seems more than ever we need people with experience around these issues. And the cadence of American politics, and in fact global politics to outsiders, is very dangerous. It is harder now, it's always been hard, for someone who spent their entire career as an academic or a business person, or even for that matter a military officer, to become president. I think now it's set up to fail. It's set up to fail. The closest equivalent to president today that I can find is mayor of a big city. Mayor of a big city is the closest you have, where you have lots of authority, but you can't directly do anything. You have so many stakeholders and all kinds of issues, from what's happening outside your city to what's happening inside your city, and learning to navigate and move through that space is closest to what it means to be president. CEOs have much more direct authority. Academics have much more time to think, right? And most senators and governors don't actually have to deal with this kind of executive experience, right? Being governor of Arkansas does not prepare you to be president of the United States in this way. Second implication, I think, is that in fact many of the institutions that we use to try to make strategy are actually undermining strategy. I have lots of friends, including the person who is NSC advisor now, and I respect what people do in those jobs, but those are not the right institutions to do it. We've actually created more bureaucracy in a way that actually makes it harder. And every NSS now, every national security strategy, becomes like a State of the Union, right? A garbage can for all the different things that different bureaus want. We need fewer people, not more people, and we need more focused attention on priorities. Multiplying the number of actors and multiplying the number of agencies makes this impossible. We've reached the point now where we had Franklin Roosevelt, we had Roosevelt, Marshall, and a few other people who thought about strategy, Admiral Leahy and others. Now we have not only an NSC advisor and NSC team for the president, we have the State Department and their policy planning team, and then we have the Vice President's office that has its own national security advisor. And so they spend time fighting with each other, not actually thinking about these issues. Less is more. Less is more. And populist solutions, which we see a lot of and hear a lot of today, they generally don't work. It's not that populism is bad. Great leaders like Roosevelt, Lincoln, and others use a populist appeal to explain and justify non-populist decisions. So I'm not against populism as a political tool, but the art of leadership is using populism to describe and educate people about things that don't apparently seem to be in their interest. That's what Roosevelt did with bringing the United States to war in World War II. That's what America's best presidents did during the Cold War. We have to move away from crisis decision making. Everything is a crisis now. Everything is a crisis. For the last two National Security Councils, I've asked my friends what moments were without crisis, and they can't come up with one. And at the very least, we should not create crises of our own. We should have a conservation of crisis. Conservation of crisis. We need to do much more to educate voters. And the biggest point, the one I actually made in the Washington Post on Monday, we need to make sure that our foreign policy is about a few things, and a few things that the entire American public buys into. Instead of doing policy by increment and by interest group, we have to return to actually a simpler foreign policy keyed to and directly connected to shared sacrifice by Americans. I think we have outsourced and segmented policy because of the segmentation of American power around the world. And that is what's actually made Americans, I think, so skeptical about our foreign policy. I don't think Americans are any less interested in national security today than they were in 1946. And in fact, they were probably more isolationist in 1946. And they were probably more racist in 1946 and more colonialist in 1946. But the story of the early Cold War was convincing Americans what really mattered and aligning our institutions for a time behind that. That's the hard work of leadership. And too often, when I study foreign policy and when I'm in foreign policy meetings, the effort is by foreign policy elites to try to figure out a way to get things by the American public or get things through Congress, rather than actually doing the hard work of building support for the things that matter for the United States. Two of them should be at the top of our list. This last paragraph is not in my book, but this is my thoughts on the historical lessons for today. Throughout our history, the issues that have best served the American government and American society have involved when we have built alliances that serve our interests and when we have expanded the range for American economic activity abroad. That doesn't mean we have to go and push ourselves into other markets. But opening and expanding economic opportunity, that's what Lincoln and the Republican Party was all about, and building alliances that will provide secure environments for us and the things we care about, that's what's always worked. That's the role of the president. And to divert from that, there should be a high bar for what we think could be more important to justify that. So I'll leave it at that. I know you have some questions, Mark.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. No, that's terrific. Applaud you, first of all, for taking on the subject of the history of the office, because it's a lot harder to make that sound exciting to readers than just telling stories about the presidents like a lot of other people do. So it's great that you've been able to do this in a way that actually is engaging.
Well, thank you.
And make great points about the power of the presidency, how it's actually undermined itself. Another point I also mentioned too, the need to get into the nitty-gritty and not look at the 30,000 feet. I mean, that's one of the things I've found. You really have to get into the details, and that's one of the great advantages of serious history, is that really going into the details is fundamental to what we do.
And that's what your work does so well on Vietnam.
Oh, well, you're too kind. But I was actually going to point out something that I found very amusing, that when you talk about Kennedy being extremely overscheduled and just has his hands in everything, I hadn't really thought of this, but at the same time that this is going on, the U.S. government is telling South Vietnamese President Diem to start delegating more authority because he's doing too much himself. So it's a degree of hypocrisy that I found.
Well, that's often common, right? That we tell other countries to do the opposite of what we're doing. Like we're telling the Pakistanis now, right? More civil control of the military, right? No nepotism. Right, that's what we're saying to them right now.
I'll just ask you a couple questions.
Please.
So we have a little time for the audience. So one of the arguments you often hear about why recent presidents haven't been as effective is that we are in an era of hyper-partisanship, and as you point out the role of party and partisanship is it's been an evolving theme, and initially founding fathers, a lot of them didn't even think parties would exist. But is there much truth to that? What role did party and partisanship play in this? In the post FDR period, especially.
Yeah, I think partisanship, as of course you know, is not new. But the first point that has to be made is that the founders really wanted the president to be above party, and most presidents, through even past World War II, really try when they're in office to represent the American public as a whole and the American national interest. But they remain very closely tied to party, particularly after World War II. Because there's more and more money in politics, and what parties do is raise money. Everyone knows that, right? And so they become very attached to that. And parties get people out to vote. And one of the things that's happened is that other mechanisms for getting people out to vote have declined, right? So during the Jacksonian era, saloons were the places where people were mobilized to vote, right? There was a lot of, it was around those kinds of politics. If you read Alexis de Tocqueville, he's struck by the sort of ways in which ordinary life is imbued with politics. And then in the early 20th century, it's actually unions. And through the middle of the 20th century, unions. But after World War II, parties become the vote-producing machines in places of the bosses who had run the cities and things like that. So party matters. I think for most presidents, they see even their own party as a constraint once they're in office, because they really do have the urge. And I really want to make this point. For all the problems of the presidency, for the most part, the people who have been in the office have actually tried to do the job really well and have been talented people. That's what makes it so important to understand the office as such. And most have really tried to represent the American people and get above party. But the structure makes that hard.
Yeah. You make a very strong case for the FDR being really the last highly effective president. Even as you mentioned, by that time, the government is already huge. It's grown exponentially, both in terms of domestic programs and military and foreign policy. And you talk a little bit, you mentioned too how Reagan tried to some extent to delegate, but didn't work very well for him. For a president going forward, if they really rigorously applied the FDR model, would it work now, or have times changed too much that even FDR couldn't deal with the situation?
Well, I think the way FDR did things wouldn't work now, because it was still pretty chaotic with FDR. He just barely kept it going. He was able to manage the chaos. I think he would drown in it now too. But there's still a lot of things that one could learn from FDR. A few things. First of all, FDR did not think that being president was being the smartest person and having the answers. He was very comfortable, and this is rare with presidents. Most presidents are really good people, but most of them are also egomaniacs. And in fact, you could argue the office chooses for that. I could sometimes think the stars on shoulders also choose for that, right? FDR was uniquely, and Eisenhower in his best moments was this way too, able to bring smart people together and let them talk without telling them what he thought and taking in what they said. And that's an effective use of advisors. FDR also was willing, as I said, to fail and recognize failure. He didn't often call it failure, but he was willing to zigzag and try doing different things. And he always knew, and Marshall helped him with this a lot in World War II, what his priorities were. Right? The priority for the New Deal was one thing, right? Jobs. Jobs, 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 jobs. And the priority for World War II, this is why the unconditional surrender statement is made, right? What was defeating fascism, right? Not winning battles, right? Not, unfortunately, saving Jews, right? It was defeating fascism, full stop. So that disciplined sense of priority, I think, is an important part. So there are things we could learn, but part of my point here is that even an FDR would struggle today.
Great. Well, we've got time for a few questions from the audience. So, sir, front right. Oh, we got a microphone coming for you.
Okay. There are two presidents, post-World War II presidents, who were rather well qualified to deal with national security matters. And you don't mention either one of them, or haven't mentioned in your, I haven't read your book. Clearly, Dwight Eisenhower.
Right.
And Bush 41, George H.W. Bush. Did you study their modus operandi, the way they managed the office of the presidency in terms of diplomacy, national security, military-related matters, because those two,
Sure.
as opposed to the others,
Sure.
were uniquely qualified, it seems to
I
me.
think that's right. I think there's a good insight in that. I say a little bit about Eisenhower in here, but mostly in other things I've written. I have not studied George H.W. Bush closely, but what I've read certainly comports with that. I think Eisenhower and George H.W. Bush had two advantages, and I'll point out how those were also limited advantages, but two advantages that most other presidents didn't have that came from their experience. The first was they had an inner self-confidence that they could understand the issues and were willing to say no to people who had a lot of legitimacy making an alternative argument, right? So Kennedy is very intimidated by people like LeMay. Obama is very intimidated by military officers, right? These two men, Eisenhower and George H.W. Bush, were able to hold their own with them. And second, with regard to the issues I'm discussing, I think they had the insight that you needed in Clausewitzian terms to focus on a center of gravity, that you couldn't do everything. And so they organized their planning shops in that way. They organized their time in that way. But I think where they both had trouble was it's still the range of responsibility and the pressure of the presidency was so much greater than what they had before that they sometimes overstated their ability to manage it. So I think Eisenhower did get himself deep into crises in Quemoy-Matsu and elsewhere where he overrated his ability to control what was happening. And overrated through covert activities how he could control what was happening on the ground. And I think George H.W. Bush didn't grasp, it seems to me, that in the wake of the Persian Gulf War, right, that there were still lots of other problems out there related to that he had to deal with in Yugoslavia and elsewhere. And I think so. I don't think that either of them had all the same problems that the other presidents had, but I think even with their experience, which led them to probably outperform the others, this was still an issue. They would have been better off if they had had fewer issues to deal with as president, if we had expected them to do less as such, right?
Sir, here. Yeah. If you could state your name and affiliation to.
Henry Newsom, Secor Holdings. I was struck with, I haven't read your book, I was struck in your talk that you hardly mentioned Congress. To what extent, particularly the post-World War II rise in the vast range of responsibilities that the president now has is due to the abdication of Congress, and to what extent would might the solutions include a reassertion of congressional power?
Yes.
Because you continue to mention the size of the bureaucracy, and you compare
Henry,
congressional
absolutely.
committees to the size of OSD policy staff. It's several orders of magnitude. As
Absolutely.
one example.
Absolutely. So I do make the unoriginal argument in the book, but I think correct one, that yes, that congressional abdication of authority, particularly on war making and national security issues, has contributed to the problem. But a second thing also is that, quite frankly, I think the amount of money Congress appropriates is a problem, right? I'm not saying that on the one hand, I agree the military is under-resourced for the range of responsibilities it's given, but I think relative to the way we spend our money, it's over-resourced. And so what that does is it creates a further pressure for the president to use those resources. Time and again, you see in the meetings, civilians saying things similar to what Madeleine Albright said. We've got this big military, let's use it. Right? So there's a certain way in which it's not just that Congress has abdicated, it's also that Congress has actively funded things. And so you build the stuff, right? Yeah, exactly. So absolutely, I think one of the solutions, and I argue this, I didn't make this point here because focusing on foreign policy. One of the points I make in the epilogue is that actually the congressional side of the House is more important, and I think we actually not only need to give that more attention, we should consider, I argue this in the book, consider actually a system where we have perhaps a president and a prime minister. I know that's not going to happen anytime soon. We're the only major democracy in the world that doesn't do that now. We're the only one with a unified single executive. The only one. The other countries do it in different ways. The German president has far less authority than the French president, obviously. The Indian president does different things. But every major democracy, because of the importance of the legislative element, has an elected legislative leader, not someone chosen by a corner of a caucus of a party. Right? But the Pelosi-Ryan factor, they're not even representative of their own parties. Think how different it would be right now if we had a Speaker of the House or a Prime Minister who had authority, legislative authority, who was elected by the American people and was not held hostage by a corner of his or her party. So I think this is absolutely, to say Congress matters is actually understating it.
That's one of the problems we have with history, and I'm guilty of this too. Studying the president is a lot more fun, I think, in general, than studying Congress. So
Yeah.
there's not nearly enough
That's correct.
study of Congress relative to the presidency. So anyone looking for good research topics,
That's right.
Congress. Actually, CSIS is doing a new project on Congress.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And so if anyone's interested in that, let me know. We are close to time. We can take a few more questions. Those who need to, if anyone needs to leave, feel free to go. I know people are busy, but we had a question here, sir.
Thank you for the fascinating expose. I have just two little questions. If you could speak more about the way the office did affect the presidency and the president, and if I could borrow about the image of this car that is more and more less easy to drive. Don't you think that people speak about dysfunction? Don't you think that it's time to think about new institutions?
The State Department in particular, yes. So my book closes, again, I was trying to focus more on foreign policy, but really my book closes, the epilogue I call The New Beginning, by basically making just this point, that we're trying to get people to work in institutional settings that are not well designed to function for the purposes we want. And I guess I'm a functionalist, right? I believe that form should follow function. And right now, form does not follow function. And so taking just the State Department as an example, the State Department is set up primarily to train American, very talented people go into the Foreign Service to have lots of experience in lots of different places, right? And to then be able to do a range of responsibilities. It doesn't train them, though, to be strategic. It doesn't train them for enough jointness with other elements of the U.S. government. And it doesn't actually train them to do a lot of the on-the-ground stuff that we need them to do right now. I think it's under-resourced, but I think it's also a paradigmatic problem. I did with a number of students, including Catherine, who's in the back, we did a large study of how other countries train their diplomats. And a lot of other countries train their diplomats in ways that are more attuned to the needs of diplomats today. For example, the British diplomats do actually a lot more with social media, training them to operate in a social media world. The French diplomats do a lot more strategic training, right? The Chinese diplomats do a lot more on understanding the different countries they're in, developing area expertise. I don't think there's any country out there that has a perfect model. But I think we have to begin thinking about how our institutions should be reformed to reflect the world that we're in right now. That's a discussion we have to have.
Final question here, sir.
And I'll stay around and sign books if anyone wants to answer questions. I'll be happy to.
I have not read your book. My name is Stuart Ailey. I have no affiliation. I'm retired.
Good for you.
From the Defense Department, mostly in General Counsel's office. One other thing that I've noticed as I look at the scope of history, it seems to me that has changed dramatically in the years you're talking about, is the amount of information
Yes.
that the president and the leaders have to assimilate, manage, and the speed with which it moves around, so that it adds a real burden to trying to keep up. It may provide an advantage in the substance, but do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that's one of the things I was getting at with how presidents organize their time, and in this sense, the presidency is a case study in what all of us struggle with, right? At least for Americans, right? The studies have shown that most Americans now of our age cohort, right, work twice as hard as our parents did, but we don't earn twice as much, and we don't necessarily accomplish twice as much. It's clear. It's not even clear we're accomplishing as much as they did, right? And part of that is we're managing more information, we're doing more stuff, and that's exactly what you see with the presidency. Presidents are doing much more than ever. I can say is just a matter of fact. Presidents work harder, or have worked harder through the end of the Obama administration. Presidents worked harder in the last 30 years than they had before. We measured this all kinds of ways. We looked at this in terms of vacation time. First of all, they don't even go on vacation now at all because the whole oval moves with them, right? But they even take less time for that, right? More hours in the office, more meetings. Here's something really interesting. It totally surprised me, right? When we looked at the actual times in meetings, Reagan spent twice as much time in meetings as Harry Truman. That's extraordinary if you think about it. That's extraordinary if you think about it, right? But there's more going on. What's going on in a lot of meetings? It's information, right? People are briefing, right? The PDB in the morning, everything, right? And I think there's information overload. But also, I think it's the old Roberta Wallstetter argument, right? You can't separate the signal from the noise, right? And we are so much less strategic because we don't know where to look, right? And so we're looking everywhere. It's the problem of being an empire. Every empire falls into this, whereas smaller states, the North Vietnamese, they don't have this problem. They know exactly what they're about, right? They know exactly what they're doing. I think the terrorists know exactly what they're about. And that's why you need leadership that rises above that. And the founders recognized that on a much smaller scale in the 80s. That's why the presidency exists. And to connect with this gentleman's point, we need to set up our institutions not to be managing information overload, but to be doing the analytical work that lifts us up. And that is, more than anything, probably why history matters. We can talk about the implications of historical knowledge, but my firm belief, obviously a bias, but firm belief, is that training someone to do historical research is the best way to deal with what you and I just said. Because what do you do when you go in an archive? You're overwhelmed with stuff, right? And you've got to figure out what matters and what's the story, right? What's the story? And the better we train ourselves to do that, and maybe a little less math and a little more of that, the better we'll make policy.
That's a great point to end on. It's been a highly stimulating discussion. If you'll join me in a round of applause for Dr. Suri.